Hey folks, welcome back to Reliable Prepper. If there's one thing that's become clear, it's that we're facing a time like no other. Tensions are higher than we've seen in years, and the preparations being made across the country are unlike anything in recent history. Today, I'm going to lay out what we're up against as we approach the election and look toward the weeks and months following it, all the way to Inauguration Day. We're not here to fan flames of fear, but we have to face what's in front of us. This isn't about partisanship or taking sides, it's about being prepared and informed. And if you haven't thought about the potential for unrest this election season, now's the time to start thinking, because the government is taking these risks very seriously, and so should we. Before we dive in, if you get value from this, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. By staying connected, you're not only supporting us, but you're also ensuring you don't miss any critical updates. Also, sign up for my free bi-weekly newsletter where you'll receive my new ebook, Surviving Civil Unrest, a complete guide at no cost. In times like these, knowledge and preparation are our best allies. Let's jump right in. All right, let's start with one of the most visible signs that things are different this time around, the deployment of the National Guard. Already, we're seeing the Guard activated in several states: Nevada, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Oregon, and Washington State. The fact that the National Guard is being positioned ahead of time in multiple locations is no coincidence, and it's certainly not a routine measure. When you see this kind of large-scale preparation, it's because authorities are bracing for potential unrest that could turn dangerous or even deadly. Now, for those who may not be familiar, the National Guard is usually deployed for natural disasters, severe emergencies, or large-scale events where local authorities need extra support. They're not typically activated around election cycles unless there's a legitimate concern about potential issues at the polls or in major urban areas. When you have multiple states taking this precaution, you know officials are anticipating something serious. This is no ordinary election, folks, and the presence of the Guard tells us they're preparing for the possibility of violence, unrest, and disruptions in public spaces. This brings up questions around martial law. Martial law is when the military essentially takes control over civilian functions, suspending regular laws and sometimes curbing civil rights in the process. It's a last resort, but under extreme conditions, it can be declared to restore order or protect citizens. Now, while martial law hasn't been declared, the sight of the National Guard standing by is enough to make people wonder how close we are to it. This creates a different atmosphere around the election, one that could make people feel like their communities are under occupation or surveillance. There's also something we need to discuss here that doesn't often get brought up: DoD Directive 5240.01. This directive outlines what the military can and can't do in terms of intelligence gathering on U.S. soil. It allows for expanded monitoring of domestic situations under certain conditions, especially when there's a perceived threat to security. What does this mean for us? Well, it means that as the National Guard stands by, there may also be more monitoring going on in our public spaces, particularly near polling stations or where large groups are expected to gather. In theory, this directive is meant to protect us, but it does give the military a lot more leeway to monitor and respond to domestic events. The bigger question for many people is, where does this end? If the Guard's presence becomes more active, let's say they start enforcing curfews, intervening in protests, or even blocking access to certain areas, we're getting dangerously close to infringing on civil liberties. The U.S. has always had safeguards in place, like the Posse Comitatus Act, which prevents the federal military from acting as law enforcement on U.S. soil. But the National Guard, when activated by a state's governor, operates under different rules, and that leaves some room for interpretation. While the Guard's official role is to support local authorities, this line can blur if tensions escalate and additional action is deemed necessary. When we talk about government preparations for potential unrest, it's not just the National Guard being on standby. This involves a network of federal, state, and local agencies, all working together under what's called a unified command structure to maintain control and order if things take a turn. In cities like Portland, which have seen intense protests recently, local governments have been working with federal agencies for months. It's not only about sending out police to handle demonstrations. It involves emergency management teams, city officials, and even private entities coordinating to monitor potential hotspots, anticipate issues, and plan responses quickly and effectively. This coordination goes beyond Election Day and may be in effect all the way to Inauguration Day on January 20th, 2025. FEMA, which we usually associate with natural disasters, has adapted its role to civil emergencies, which shows how seriously the government is taking this. FEMA's presence suggests they're setting up resources to manage large gatherings of people and potential evacuation or shelter needs. When FEMA is brought in, it's a strong sign that the government is preparing for significant disruptions. Then we have the Department of Homeland Security, which is ramping up intelligence efforts. DHS's job now isn't just about watching protests, but analyzing social media and monitoring for signs of organized unrest. They're on the lookout for any threats to critical infrastructure and have their eyes on cybersecurity, ensuring that any disruptions to power, transportation, or other essential services can be contained quickly to prevent widespread panic. DHS's role in this situation is like a safety net for national security, ready to respond if things spiral out of control. Local police forces are also integrated into this coordinated effort. In most major cities, police are working closely with federal authorities, with some officers working longer shifts and specialized riot control teams on standby. Police departments are equipped with enhanced non-lethal tools, riot gear, and surveillance tech to track movement and prevent gatherings from escalating. In some places, police are getting support from private security firms, and businesses are boarding up, especially near government buildings. It's a sign that they're preparing for potential trouble that could affect everyday life in these areas. The unified command structure, in theory, is designed to ensure that authorities can respond to any situation swiftly. But when you look at the scale and depth of these preparations, it does raise questions about civil liberties and freedom of movement. With FEMA, DHS, and local law enforcement working hand in hand, we're seeing a level of coordination that's usually reserved for major disasters. This speaks volumes about how seriously the government is taking the potential for unrest and how determined they are to be in control of the situation no matter how it unfolds. We need to have an honest talk about civil liberties because, as we see more agencies and military forces mobilizing, there's a growing sense that our freedoms might be encroached upon. The United States has laws specifically designed to keep the military out of civilian affairs, laws that protect us from that kind of oversight, and for good reason. But now, as the National Guard is called up in places like Nevada, Wisconsin, and other states, we find ourselves in a murky territory where the boundaries between civilian and military oversight become unclear. And if you're feeling uneasy about that, you're definitely not alone. Think back to instances where we've seen heavy military or police presence during protests or public gatherings. We've seen how communities react when they sense they're being monitored, surveilled, or even restricted in their movements. This kind of heavy-handed oversight can lead to increased surveillance, curfews, and roadblocks, all of which work to limit the freedom we have to move and gather peacefully. And let's remember, surveillance doesn't stop at physical gatherings. It extends to monitoring communications, social media, and potentially private interactions under the banner of keeping order. This can create a climate where people start watching what they say and do, worried about who might be listening or observing. But here's the larger issue. When these kinds of security measures become routine, it's not easy to reverse them. Imagine if every election cycle starts to include this heightened military presence, increased surveillance, and restricted movement. Over time, we'd be setting a precedent that could drastically impact our freedoms. If we allow this to normalize, it could very well change how we experience everyday freedoms in the future. For those of us who deeply value liberty, this is a crucial issue that we can't afford to ignore. The question becomes, how much freedom are we willing to sacrifice for the perception of security? Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the media's role in all of this. We all know the power media holds, especially in times of tension and uncertainty. These days, news spreads at a breakneck pace, and once a story is out there, it's nearly impossible to take it back, even if it later proves to be misleading. What's becoming more obvious is how often misinformation, sensationalized coverage, and conflicting narratives aren't just random. They're sometimes driven by specific agendas. The way stories are presented can create an image of the world that feeds into division and confusion. Think about the coverage leading up to the last election. We saw an endless cycle of high-drama headlines, emotionally charged reporting, and viral social media posts that painted an increasingly bleak picture, stoking fears and ramping up anxieties. The narrative was often spun in a way that made things look as chaotic and dire as possible. For many people, this created a climate of uncertainty and unease. Being informed is one thing, but a constant flood of crisis-driven stories, especially when not thoroughly verified, ends up overwhelming rather than helping people. It's worth asking why we're always presented with the most extreme perspectives. Social media platforms like X.com, under Elon Musk's leadership, are trying to offer a space where people can share their views with less fear of censorship, promoting more open dialogue. But while this shift does create more room for genuine discussion, it also comes with a need for caution. Not everything shared online is true or reliable. If we're not careful, we can end up spreading unverified claims that only add to the confusion and intensify people's fears. Just because we have the freedom to share information doesn't mean we should overlook the responsibility to ensure it's accurate. So, what can we do? It's essential that each of us takes responsibility for verifying the sources we rely on, cross-checking facts, and taking a moment before we hit share. Mainstream media outlets have a tendency to amplify the most extreme perspectives, which can make everything feel like an immediate crisis. But by stepping back, verifying information, and only sharing what's credible, we can help reduce the noise and bring a sense of calm back to our communities. In times like these, staying informed is critical, but keeping a level head and resisting the pull of every sensational story is just as important. That way, instead of feeding into the tension, we're helping provide a bit of stability and clarity where it's needed most. Now let's talk specifics. What can we expect from here on out, all the way through January 20th, Inauguration Day? Here's the reality of the situation, based on historical events, recent developments, and the types of preparations we're already seeing in place. Starting with Election Day, November 5th, we know polls will be open nationwide, and we're likely to see a high turnout given the elevated stakes and strong feelings on both sides. But here's the thing, Election Day itself could see major disruptions at polling places, particularly in those critical battleground states where every single vote could tip the balance. We're talking about states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin. Now, if people show up to cast their vote and find themselves in long lines, or if polling stations are short-staffed, delayed, or even shut down temporarily for security reasons, that's going to create serious frustration and tension. And frustration in these high-stress environments is a powder keg waiting for a spark. Then we have the waiting period right after Election Day. In the past, Americans were often able to know the election outcome by the end of the night, or at least the next day. But let's be real here. This time, there's a high probability we won't get a clear answer that fast. With the number of absentee and mail-in ballots, legal challenges, and potential recounts in tightly contested states, the final result could be delayed for days, even weeks. And let's face it, every additional hour without clarity is only going to increase the anxiety and distrust. People will be glued to their screens, watching as numbers fluctuate and tensions build with each update. If we see contested results in these key states, we're also likely to see a wave of lawsuits. We're talking about legal battles that could drag out for weeks or even months. Remember the 2000 election? Florida's recount took over a month. Now imagine that kind of situation unfolding in multiple states at once, with each party pushing their own version of events. This legal gridlock could lead to mass protests, especially if people feel their voices or votes aren't being respected. With the courts involved, every decision is going to feel like a high-stakes battle, and those who feel disenfranchised will likely take to the streets to make themselves heard. The period after the election, from November through December, is known as the lame duck period. This is when we could see some of the most intense flashpoints. Historically, this time has been tense when election results are disputed. Think about it. If large portions of the population believe the election outcome is illegitimate, it could lead to mass demonstrations, protests, and even riots. Both sides of the political spectrum are charged up, and any perception of unfairness or tampering could trigger an explosion of frustration. In urban centers especially, there may be increased chances for clashes between opposing groups. And remember, the National Guard is already positioned in some states to support local authorities in managing any unrest. With public spaces likely monitored more closely, and potential curfews or security measures in place, this could feel very different from any post-election period we've seen before. And let's not overlook January 6th. This is when Congress officially certifies the Electoral College results. Historically, this date has been a procedural one, but we all remember what happened on January 6th. 2021. It serves as a reminder that this is another potential flashpoint if people remain dissatisfied with the election results. If a large part of the country feels the certification process doesn't reflect the will of the people, it could prompt a new wave of protests and heightened security measures. Government buildings and public spaces in D.C. and other key locations may be tightly secured, and don't be surprised if the National Guard presence is ramped up significantly around that time. Then, of course, we reach Inauguration Day on January 20th. Normally, this is the peaceful transition of power. But if significant parts of the population refuse to accept the results, this day could see unprecedented demonstrations. Remember, this isn't just a routine ceremony. This is a high-profile, heavily attended event with government leaders and crowds gathering in one place. Security around D.C. is likely to be tighter than ever, with additional perimeters set up around major landmarks and government buildings. In extreme cases, we could see movement restrictions, roadblocks, and checkpoints, especially if protests are expected to turn violent. Now, we've been focusing on these critical dates, but it's important to understand that the entire period from November to January will have an unusual level of government and military presence. With FEMA, Homeland Security, and other agencies coordinating a unified command structure, local police forces won't be alone in managing crowds or addressing emergencies. This unified approach means that if tensions spike, response teams will already be in place to act immediately, which could mean rapid escalation in cities where demonstrations flare up. And for those of you in large urban centers, this unified command structure could result in localized lockdowns or increased police presence around high-traffic areas. Looking at the big picture, these precautions and heightened security measures could be setting a precedent. The question is, are we witnessing the beginning of a new normal for elections in the United States? If tensions around election cycles continue to increase, this kind of heightened security may become standard practice. Think about it. More National Guard deployments, more monitoring, and perhaps even greater government control over public spaces could become routine elements of future elections. For many of us who've been around long enough to remember calmer election seasons, this shift feels like a loss of something valuable, a sense of security and community that used to come with voting. And let's talk about what this could mean for voter turnout. If security around elections continues to feel this intense, some people might avoid the polls out of fear or discomfort. If we see armed personnel stationed at polling sites or increased surveillance, some people may feel too intimidated to vote. This could especially impact communities that already feel targeted or vulnerable, leading to lower turnout rates. And a decline in voter participation isn't good for anyone, regardless of political beliefs. When people don't feel safe to exercise their right to vote, our democracy as a whole takes a hit. The reality is, rebuilding public trust is going to be key if we want to maintain a stable society. People need to feel that their votes are counted fairly and that they can participate safely without feeling threatened or watched. Transparency is essential here. Government leaders and officials must work to show that they are operating fairly and are committed to protecting everyone's rights. For many of us, that starts with understanding our local governments, holding officials accountable, and getting involved in the process in any way we can. One of the best ways to counter the sense of fear and loss is to engage with our communities. Being active in your community, knowing your neighbors, and building relationships with people you can rely on. These are some of the most effective steps you can take to keep your local area stable and secure. When people feel they're part of a connected community, they're less likely to act out in ways that disrupt the peace. Local groups, neighborhood watches, and preparedness networks all play a critical role in fostering a sense of safety and unity, no matter what happens on the national level. All right, folks, that's a look at what's on the horizon. We're facing a season of uncertainty that could stretch from Election Day all the way through Inauguration Day. From potential disruptions at the polls to high-stakes legal battles, the deployment of the National Guard, and increased surveillance. And it's on each of us to stay informed, stay grounded, and most importantly, stay prepared. If you haven't done so already, now's the time to take your personal preparedness seriously. Stock up on essential supplies, have a plan in place, and make sure your loved ones know what to do if things start to spiral. If you found this video helpful, please remember to like and subscribe to keep up with more critical updates. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook for real-time news as things unfold. Also, make sure you're signed up for my free bi-weekly newsletter. In it, you'll get updates, tips, and information that can help you navigate through these unpredictable times. And as a bonus, you'll receive my latest ebook, Surviving Civil Unrest, a complete guide, for free. In times like these, being informed is one of the best ways to stay prepared and keep your peace of mind. We're all in this together, and the more we stay connected, the better we'll be able to face whatever comes our way. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and remember to keep preparing, stay vigilant, and be ready to support your community when it needs it most. This is Reliable Prepper, signing off. Until next time.